The next page I would like you to look at in your manual is page number 9. Page number 9 is the actual card that we will be using to evaluate soils at a given site. And we'll need to become very familiar with this card in terms of what criteria are we evaluating, what do we need to evaluate when we walk up to that pit site, and based upon our evaluation, which is in part 1, the left-hand side of the card, we will be making specific recommendations on part 2, the right-hand side of this land evaluation card. So what I'm going to do next is to go through each of these particular factors on the left-hand side of the card. Utilizing your manual, I'd like you to follow along with me in this manual, and as we go through this, we'll be talking about each of these criteria and how you're going to evaluate that at that particular site. What I'd like you to do in this next part of the discussion is to, in your packet of materials, you'll have several of these blank forms that are copies of page 9 in your manual. And what I'd like you to do is to have one of these lying beside you as we go through and talk about each of these characteristics to be evaluated in your manual. So I'm going to turn over to page 10 and 11 in your manual, but remember to have one of these blank land evaluation cards lying beside you so you can see how this works as we go through it. The first factor that we're going to evaluate is discussed on page 11 of your manual, and that is the texture of the soil. Well, texture, as we've already mentioned, is the percentage of sand, silt, and clay in a soil. We are not going to be able to, under field conditions, determine the exact percentage of sand, silt, and clay. So what we're going to be doing is to be determining soil texture by feel. Now, in the very first lab for this course, you did that. We went through and determined soil texture by feel. We talked about the degree of grittiness, the degree of smoothness, those types of characteristics, how well the soil would ribbon. And those were illustrated to you on the tape for laboratory number 1. Well, under field conditions, we're going to be doing the same thing. We're going to be taking the soil, we're going to be wetting it, and we're going to be, by feel, determining the approximate percentages of sand, silt, and clay in this soil. We're going to do that based on the grittiness, smoothness, or stickiness or plasticity of the soil. We're also going to be doing this on the basis of how well that soil ribbons, which is to say, as we push it out between our thumb and forefinger, what length of ribbon can we form? Well, the greater the ability to be cohesive or stay together is based upon the quantity of clay primarily in that particular soil. And your manual here explains the characteristics imparted to a soil by sand, silt, and clay-sized particles. Now, we don't have to determine the exact textural class name of that soil. All we have to be able to do when we look at item number 1 on our land evaluation card is to put it into one of 5 basic categories, those being coarse, moderately, medium, moderately fine, or fine. And which textural classifications fit into that are shown to you on page 12 of your manual. So the coarse textured soils, of course, are the sands and the loamy sands. The moderately coarse are the sandy loam, fine sandy loams. Loamy soils are anywhere from a very fine sandy loam through a silt. Moderately fine are clay loams, sandy clays, and silty clay loams. And then, of course, the clay soils are the sandy clays, the silty clay, and the clay. So those are given to you in your manual here. Generally speaking, most of the soils in this Pacific Northwest region, at least being used for dry land, oftentimes will fall into the moderate or moderately fine textural classification. If, however, we are working with soils that are typical in many of our irrigated areas within this region, we then find coarser soils, anywhere from loamy sands into the sandy loam type of category. So those determining soil texture by feel was illustrated on lab tape number 1. It is also going to be illustrated for you on the field exercise where we went through and determined soil textural class by feel. And you'll just need to be able to, given the textural class name, fit it into one of these 5 categories. Subsoil texture works very much the same way. Oftentimes, in the subsoil texture, we will see that it is a little bit finer in texture than is the topsoil. Now, the major reason this often occurs is that as soils weather and develop, Some of the finer sized particles, specifically the clay sized particles, alluviate or move downward in the profile and are often deposited right near the top of the B horizon, which we by common name call the subsoil. So this alluviation and redeposition of clay at a greater depth can cause the subsoil to actually be somewhat finer in texture than the topsoil. When you're at one of these land evaluation sites, the topsoil and subsoil are placed into receptacles or containers so that you don't have to determine where is the topsoil beginning and ending in this profile and where is the subsoil beginning and ending. Those particular samples are provided for you at that site, and as we see on the videotape, I will utilize those samples that are provided for us to determine the textural class name of the soil. Your only involvement in this exercise will be to take that textural class name and put it into the appropriate textural class as provided for you on parts A and B of this score sheet.